This is a student presentation using a hypothetical scenario for educational purposes. I, the presenter, am a student at UAMS and not a representative of the agency named in the following slides. The information contained herein does not necessarily reflect the views of said agency. My name is Carissa Ansel, and I am an occupational health consultant for a large catering company called Cypress Catering Incorporated, and I am going to be giving a yearly talk about foodborne illnesses and, frankly, how to avoid them just before all of the outdoor parties that have been scheduled. In this presentation, I will be discussing the causes of foodborne illness, common foodborne germs, foodborne illness prevention, and the HACCP model. The BC Cook Articulation Committee identified 10 top causes of foodborne illnesses. These are them listed: improper cooling, advanced preparation, infected person, inadequate reheating for hot holding, improper hot holding, contaminated raw food or ingredient, unsafe source, use of leftovers, cross-contamination, and inadequate cooking. As you can see from this list, foodborne illnesses are highly preventable, which is why it is so important for us to have this presentation. The CDC and the FDA have identified 6 common foodborne germs of most concern. They have coined these germs as the Big Six. These pathogens, according to the FDA, have a low infectious dose, contaminate the gastrointestinal system after ingestion, and are shed in feces. They also spread in high numbers. As a food employee, you should be most concerned with these 6 germs. The 6 germs of concern are norovirus, hepatitis A, Salmonella typhi, Shigella, Escherichia E. coli, also known as E. coli, and non-typhoidal Salmonella. We will now go into a little bit of detail about each of these. The first of the big 6 that we are going to look at is norovirus. Norovirus spreads through contact with an infected person or through contact with contaminated food, water, or surfaces. The symptoms of norovirus are nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and stomach pain. In severe cases, due to the increase of diarrhea and vomiting, dehydration may be a concern. Typically, norovirus develops in 24 to 48 hours after consumption of the contaminated food, and it usually lasts about 24 to 60 hours. Again, in most cases, norovirus is a pretty mild disease, but in severe cases, due to dehydration, someone may need to seek medical attention. The main foods to be concerned with are salad and shellfish when it comes to norovirus. The second of the big 6 pathogens is hepatitis A. Hepatitis A spreads through contact with an infected person or through contact with contaminated food or water. The symptoms of hepatitis A are diarrhea, vomiting, nausea, abdominal pain, jaundice, dark urine, or pale stool. Hepatitis A is a little bit different from the other foodborne pathogens in that the incubation period is quite long. It could develop 15 to even 50 days after you consume food or water that is contaminated with hepatitis A. Most people experience symptoms for only 1 to 2 weeks in a mild case. However, in severe cases, hepatitis A illness could last for months. The foods of concern with hepatitis A are water, salads, frozen fruits and vegetables, and shellfish. Now, it should be noted that hepatitis A has a pretty widely accepted vaccine given to infants here in the United States, which makes hepatitis A a pretty small concern here in the U.S. However, for global health policy, hepatitis A is still a concern. The third of the big 6 is Salmonella typhi, which causes typhoid fever. Typhoid fever is spread through contact with an infected person or through the consumption of contaminated food or water. The symptoms of typhoid fever is high fever, hence the name, weakness, stomach pain, diarrhea, or constipation, headache, cough, or loss of appetite. The length of Salmonella typhi, it develops in about 6 to 30 days after consumption of a contaminated food or water source. And if caught early enough, it can be treated with antibiotics, and it can last about a week. If untreated, it can go about 4 weeks before having any relief. Foods of concern include water, seafood, raw vegetables, and contaminated milk. Similar to hepatitis A, typhoid fever has a vaccine. However, in areas of the world with poor sanitation, such as East and Southeast Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and South America, typhoid fever may be of greater concern than it is here in the United States. The fourth of the big six pathogens is Shigella. Shigella causes a disease called shigellosis, and it spreads by consuming contaminated food or water, through sexual contact with an infected person, or through contact with infected surfaces. The symptoms of Shigella include diarrhea, fever, and stomach cramps, and typically Shigella develops within 1 to 2 days after consumption of the contaminated food or water, and the symptoms last around 7 days. The main foods to be concerned with Shigella is salads, raw vegetables, milk, and poultry. The fifth of the big six pathogens is E. coli. E. coli spreads by consuming contaminated food, water, or touching a surface and then putting your hand in your mouth. The symptoms of E. coli are diarrhea, stomach cramps, and vomiting, and E. coli infection typically develops within 3 to 4 days after consumption, and it lasts about 5 to 7 days. The main foods of concern are unpasteurized milk, soft cheeses, undercooked beef, and raw vegetables, as well as contaminated water. The final of the big six pathogens is non-typhoidal salmonella. This spreads through contact with infected animals, their feces, or their environment, and it also can spread through consumption of contaminated food or water. The symptoms of non-typhoidal salmonella are diarrhea, fever, abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting. This disease develops about 6 to 72 hours after consumption of the contaminated food or water, and it lasts 2 to 7 days. The main foods to be concerned about with non-typhoidal salmonella are poultry, eggs, meat, milk, and green vegetables. As already mentioned, foodborne illnesses are extremely preventable with a few food safety precautions. These precautions can be grouped into 4 different groups: clean, separate, cook, and chill. We will now go into a little bit of detail about each of these. The first and frontline precaution is to clean. Wash your hands and surfaces often. This fights against fecal-oral pathogens. Another good thing to do is to wear gloves when handling food. The FDA calls this the no bare hand contact policy. It is also important to report wounds that you might see or get on your hands or your arms to your management. Make sure you rinse fresh fruits and vegetables and scrub them under tap water. And wash all of your food prep areas, whether that be cutting boards or a counter, with hot soapy water. The next precaution is to separate. Separate raw meats from other foods. Separating raw meats from as soon as you get them at the grocery store all the way until you get them in the refrigerator is extremely important. It's also important to remember to use separate food prep areas for raw meats and fresh produce, as you can see a picture here. And it's important to not reuse marinades that you once used on raw meats before boiling it. The next precaution is to cook. Cook food to the right temperature. Use a food thermometer to ensure that the food is cooked to a proper safe minimum temperature. As you can see here on this chart, there are certain temperatures for certain foods. For example, poultry should be cooked to a minimum of 165 degrees Fahrenheit, while ground meat or seafood may only need to be cooked to 155 degrees Fahrenheit. It's also important to keep in mind when you're microwaving something to stir and rotate that food to ensure even cooking. Another note on reheating, it is important to boil your soups, sauces, and gravies before you serve them. The fourth precaution is to chill, which means to refrigerate foods promptly. For you guys, we're talking about upcoming outdoor catering events, and so in the summer here in Arkansas, the temperature is typically above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So that means that your foods need to be refrigerated within 1 hour of being in those outdoor temperatures. Should you have an indoor event and the temperature is less than 90 degrees Fahrenheit, you can go ahead and leave those out for 2 hours before you need to refrigerate or freeze those perishables. It's also important to keep in mind to only thaw food in the refrigerator, in cold water, or in the microwave. This means not out on the counter at room temperature. And always marinate food in the refrigerator. The FDA has identified a certain range of temperatures as the danger zone. This zone is between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and at this temperatures, bacteria in food can rapidly multiply. This means for you guys to keep hot food hot, which means at or above 140 degrees Fahrenheit until it's time to serve it, and to keep cold food cold, which means at or below 40 degrees Fahrenheit until serving time. And we want to make sure we don't leave that food out for longer than 2 hours or 1 hour again if you're at an outdoor event where it's greater than 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The HACCP model stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points Model. The local Public Health Institute of Massachusetts defines it as this: a management system in which food safety is addressed through the analysis and control of biological, chemical, and physical hazards from raw material production, procurement, and handling to manufacturing, distribution, and consumption of the finished product. There are 7 main principles of the HACCP model. First, it is to conduct a hazard analysis, which means that you analyze the likelihood of a hazard and the severity of it should the hazard occur. The second principle is to determine the critical control points. This is a control that will reduce the hazard to an acceptable level. Thirdly, establish critical limits. Critical limits are boundaries for safety for each of the critical control points. Fourth, establish monitoring procedures. Monitor a critical limit on a continuous basis, or if you can't do that continually, do it at a frequent basis so you are aware of where the limit is. Fifth, establish corrective actions. This just establishes an accountability for employees to follow this plan and to make sure they're doing everything they can to keep the food safety standard. Sixth, establish verification procedures, which is just a way to ensure that the limits set are scientifically backed and that we adapt this plan as needed. And finally, establish record keeping and documentation procedures, which is just to have a clear written plan for any employees to access. It is my hope that through this presentation you have learned a little bit more about foodborne illnesses, common foodborne germs, and how you as an employee in the food service and catering businesses can actively work to decrease foodborne illness in both yourself and those whom you serve.